Welcome back to Race Report, everyone. We have just finished the French Grand Prix for 2022. So let's get stuck straight into how that went, shall we? Firstly, we knew coming into the race that Sainz and Kevin Magnussen were going to be starting from the back of the grid due to engine-related penalties. Yes, sadly, we have started to see some engine-related penalties. We're only toward the midway of the season, so it's only going to get worse. But what were they going to do from the back? And it did actually affect qualifying in an interesting way. So let's jump into qualifying. It started off fairly standard. Out in Q1, we had Zhou, Stroll, Gasly, Latifi, and Schumacher, who had his final time deleted. I think he went up to like P6 with his time, but he had it deleted, which is such a shame for him, but that meant he was out in Q1. Out in Q2, we had Vettel, Albon, Bottas, Ricciardo, and Ocon. Now Q3 is where we saw something a little bit different. Sainz completely sacrificed himself. Obviously he knew he was starting at the back, the Ferrari knew he was starting at the back. He seemed to be the fastest man out there, but he sacrificed his Q3 to give Leclair a slipstream and a tow down the straights, which secured Charles Leclerc pole position. Red Bull obviously didn't do this. Obviously both cars for them could fight, so it ended up being Verstappen P2 and Perez P3. The race itself got underway well. Leclerc got away really well. He stayed in front of Verstappen. Hamilton had a great start, got past Perez very quickly, and Alonso actually had a really good start and jumped up to 5th place as well. A few corners in, we did see Ocon tangle with Tsunoda. Tsunoda goes for a spin and falls to the back of the grid, and Ocon gets a 5-second penalty for his troubles. After the first lap though, Magnussen is the big mover. Obviously he's toward the back of the grid, and he's moved up from last to 13th place. What a good job he's done. Sainz was a bit more cautious, picking off one person at a time, but he was also moving forward at that time, just not as much as Magnussen. The early laps were all about Red Bull on the hunt. It was very entertaining. We had Perez chasing down Hamilton for that 3rd place that he lost there at the start, and Verstappen right behind Leclerc chasing him down for the race lead. This carried on for a good amount of laps, a really good set amount of laps, and it looked like from this point of view that the Red Bulls were on the charge and they were going to have their men. But it wasn't until about lap 9, lap 10 that we saw that actually they weren't going to get their men and they were starting to run into trouble. Probably tyre trouble. Running behind another car is obviously going to heat up your tyres quite a bit. So it looked like they were starting to run into a bit of trouble. Perez had to drop back from Hamilton, and then suddenly Russell, the car behind, wasn't that far away, and Verstappen had to drop back from Leclerc. So both Red Bulls, who were on the hunt, had been stifled in their overtaking bids. And Leclerc especially looked like he'd done a good job, because not only had he kept Verstappen behind him, but he was also preserving his tyres at that time whilst Verstappen was using up his. Sainz also continues his march forward. He's actually in the points by lap 15. It's very impressive and it's entertaining stuff as he's just moving by one guy at a time, moving past. And we don't have to wait long till one of our front runners pits. It is on lap 17. Max Verstappen comes in for what looks to be an undercut on Charles Leclerc. He does return back in 7th place, which is a bit further down than he really want to, I think. But Leclerc stays out. He doesn't respond immediately. Ferrari are going to keep Leclerc out. And I don't know if that's a mistake or not, because Leclerc comes off the track. He loses it at turn 11. He goes skidding into the barriers and he is out of the French Grand Prix. It's his 3rd retirement from a leading position this season. Oh man, it's got to be gutting for Ferrari. He's thankfully fine. It wasn't too much of a big hit. He does later tell us on the broadcast that it was solely his mistake and that he just can't afford to keep making them. You got to feel for the guy. He was painfully honest with us in his assessment of things, that he's got to take responsibility for his mistakes, and this was his mistake. Of course, that shakes things up in a massive way. A safety car comes out and everyone who hasn't pitted comes in. And of course, Max Verstappen's just pitted, so his tyres aren't that old, and he's now staying out whilst everybody else is pitting for their quick pit stops. He's the race leader at this point, so the fact that he came out in 7th is nullified. I think his tyres were about 2 laps older, so that's not too much of a big deal either. Everybody else comes out in pretty much the order they came in on, so we have Hamilton in 2nd place and Perez in 3rd. Sainz is the only person that appears to actually have trouble with the pit stop. He has first a slow stop and then gets released unsafely into the pit lane, causing Alex Albon to stamp on his brakes. He gets a 5-second penalty for that, and at the time it looked like Ferrari were just making it really hard on themselves. Obviously, if Leclair went off and that was his fault, fair enough, there's nothing they could do about that. But the way they reacted, making 2 mistakes in quick succession with their remaining car, obviously is not going to help things. The safety car comes in on lap 20 and we go racing again. And of course, Sainz is the first man to make moves. He very quickly gets himself back into 5th place. We see a tussle further down the grid. Zhou loses the rear and whacks Schumacher. Schumacher goes for a spin and Zhou has to pit for a brand new nose, so they both fall down to the back of the grid. We see a really good fight on lap 30 between Sainz and Russell. Sainz eventually gets his man for 4th place, but it was a really good back and forth fight for a little bit there. Then we see more contact further down the field between Magnussen and Latifi this time. Latifi's the one who goes for a spin, but he's able to keep going. Again, they fall down to the back of the field as a result. I noticed in this race there was lots of little bits of contact that you wouldn't necessarily expect. The guys are usually very respectful and they can kind of get through a race with, 1 or 2 bits of contact. This had quite a few actually, so it was very surprising to see. And of course, we're heading back to seemingly our main man, Carlos Sainz, this race, as he's in the middle of another overtake again. This time on Sergio Perez. He wants 3rd place from Perez. He's followed him for a few laps now. He's ready to put the move on. And while he's in the middle of his overtake, Ferrari radio him, like no joke, Ferrari radio him to say, "Hey, can you come into the pits, please? Box, box." What are they doing? Are they not watching the action on screen? Because he is literally in the middle of an overtake on Sergio Perez whilst they're saying, "Hey Carlos, do you mind coming into the pits, please?" It was unbelievable, and Carlos rightfully came on the radio after the move was done and was like, "Guys, come on, what are you doing?" There was actually a lot of talk about Carlos Sainz's strategy and Ferrari's strategy for Carlos Sainz, because when the safety car came out and he came into the pits, he put on medium tyres, and most people, myself included, didn't think that mediums were going to get him to the end of the race. He was going to do a 2-stop strategy. However, he looked to be making it work. His tyres didn't look great, but he was still one of the fastest men out on track, still making moves on 3rd place Sergio Perez. So it looked to be working, but then Ferrari are sat there calling him into the pits whilst he's making an overtake. So who knows what's going on in the Ferrari strategy department. I think we've said that pretty much every race so far this season. But Sainz wasn't the only one who wanted to make a move on Perez. Russell saw Sainz do it and thought, "I can do that too," and went for a very late move. Perez backed out and goes off track to avoid the contact, which got Russell very animated, but the battle wasn't done there. It would continue on for several laps to come yet. This is when we see, with 10 laps remaining, Sainz come into the pits. He gets called in by Ferrari, properly this time, when he's not making an overtake on somebody. He has to serve his 5-second penalty he got for the unsafe release, and he drops all the way down to 9th. So the big question on everybody's mind is, did that pit stop have to happen? The 5-second penalty would have been applied to his race time, regardless whether he pitted or not. So the only question was, would his tyres have lasted to the end of the race? Ferrari said they wouldn't, but they look to be holding up alright so far. Of course, that meant the cameras stayed with Sainz for quite a bit, because he was on his fresh tyres, quickly moving up the field. He got back into 5th very, very quickly. And that's where he'd sit for the rest of the race. I think there was like a 20-second gap between Russell in 4th and Sainz in 5th when he finally got 5th. and that was just too big of a gap for him to, even setting fastest laps, he was never going to catch up. We did have a bit of late drama as we had a virtual safety car deployed with 3 laps to go as Zhou pulls off to the side of the track. He pulled off in a very good area and the safety car was resolved very, very quickly. I think it was even less than a lap it was out, so nobody pitted. It ended very quickly. No real drama except for one moment, and it was George Russell getting past Sergio Perez on the restart. It looked like Perez was just about to start warming his tyres as the lights went green again, and Russell just drove past him. At that point, Perez and Russell had a really, really good fight for the final podium position for the final few laps, and Russell won out in the end. At the end of the race, we had Max Verstappen win the French Grand Prix, a very easy drive for him after Leclair retired. Hamilton finished second, barely mentioned him as well because, again, he was just on his own doing his race. Nobody else around him, no real overtakes, so we didn't really get to see much of either first or second in this race once Leclerc retired. Like I said earlier, Russell did beat Perez for 3rd place, so that is the first double podium for Mercedes this season. They get a 2nd and a 3rd. Our man Sainz finished in 5th place in the end with a fastest lap, but also plenty of questions on the strategy side for Ferrari. Not for the first time. Like I said, pretty much every single race we are questioning Ferrari's strategy right now. And it does seem like they are not built for a title challenge. They've built a brilliant car that is ready for a title challenge, but is their strategy? Mercedes now are only 40-ish points behind them in the championship, and that car is only going to get better. So they might lose out on 2nd place with the way things are going right now. So overall, a fairly entertaining race. I think it was made more entertaining by Sainz starting at the back and moving through the grid. If it wasn't for that, I think it would have been quite a low-key one. But what do you think? Do you have any thoughts on Ferrari's strategy? Any thoughts on Leclerc's mistake? Go ahead and pop them in the comments or hit me up over on social media at Race Report Pod. The next race is next week in Hungary and I can't wait to bring it to you. So feel free to subscribe, feel free to follow, all that stuff, and I will catch you in the next one.